A lioness appears at a man's door and leaves her injured cub at his feet. Not understanding anything, he picks it up and realizes it's still alive. Against all instincts, he decides to try to save it with his own hands. But no one was prepared for what this act would unleash. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The sun was still battling the morning mist when Michael opened the weathered wooden door that protected his house from the vast frigid expanses of the plateau. 5 years had passed since he'd chosen this refuge far from everything and everyone, where the wind whispered ancient secrets, and silence was his only faithful companion. The routine was always the same: bitter coffee, checking the cisterns, maintaining the solar panels that powered his minimalist life. Nothing more, nothing less. That was exactly how he preferred it. But that morning something was different. Standing at the threshold, Michael felt his heart inexplicably race. There, just a few meters away, an adult lioness watched him with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. There was no threat in her posture, only a profound exhaustion that he immediately recognized. It was the same weariness he felt when looking at himself in the cracked bathroom mirror. The same dull pain that had accompanied him since he decided to flee from civilization. The feline's golden coat was covered with dust and small scratches, evidence of a long and arduous journey. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just remained there, as if waiting for something only she knew. Between her jaws, she carried with delicacy something that made Michael swallow hard. A small cub, apparently lifeless. Seconds dragged on like hours. Michael knew he should retreat, close the door, perhaps make some noise to scare the animal away. It was the logical protocol, what any sensible person would do, but there was something in that mother's eyes that completely paralyzed him. It was a silent plea, a request that transcended the barriers between species. The lioness took 2 cautious steps toward the house and placed the cub on the ground with a gentleness that contrasted with her wild nature. The small body remained motionless on the cold earth, and for a moment Michael believed it was too late. But then, like an almost imperceptible miracle, he saw a subtle spasm in the cub's hind leg. It was still alive. The lioness backed away a few meters, but kept her eyes fixed on Michael. It wasn't a threatening or distrustful look. It was pure maternal desperation, the understanding that her claws and instincts couldn't save what perhaps human hands could. She had traveled miles, perhaps days, to reach this place. But how did she know of his existence? How had a wild beast found the only human being in hundreds of square miles? Michael knelt slowly, without sudden movements. The cub was smaller than he had imagined. Couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Its breathing was irregular, almost imperceptible, and a small wound on its hind paw was bleeding slightly. With extreme care, he lifted the warm little body and felt a shiver run down his spine. How long had it been since he'd touched another living being? "Easy, little one," he murmured, surprising himself with his own hoarse voice after hours of silence. "Let's see what we can do." The lioness followed him with her gaze as he headed inside the house, but made no move to follow him. It was as if she understood that this was human territory, a space where her paws should not tread. Michael observed her through the kitchen window, while improvising a nest with clean towels and positioning a lamp nearby to generate heat. The cub was dehydrated and very weak. Michael vaguely remembered reading about first aid for wild animals, from a time when he still believed that information might be useful someday. He diluted a small amount of honey in warm water and, with a syringe found in the first aid kit, managed to administer a few drops into the cub's mouth. The reaction was almost immediate, a reflexive movement of the tongue followed by a weak sigh. It was a good sign. As he worked, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. Each movement, each care, each check of the cub's breathing connected him to a version of himself he believed was lost forever. His hands, calloused from isolation and manual labor, rediscovered a forgotten delicacy. The satellite phone rang, interrupting the tense silence. It was Rose, the only person who maintained sporadic contact with him, a veterinarian from the nearest town who occasionally needed information about local wildlife. Michael never imagined that one day he would be the one who needed her. "Rose, I need help," he said without preamble, quickly describing the situation. From the other end of the line, he heard a concerned silence before the professional response. "Michael, you need to be very careful. I'm leaving now with Dr. Helen, a specialist in wild felines, but it will take at least 4 hours to get to you. In the meantime, keep the cub warm, hydrated with small amounts of honey water, and watch its breathing. If it becomes very irregular, call me immediately. 4 hours, an eternity when you're fighting against time to save such a fragile life. Michael hung up the phone and turned his attention back to the cub, which now seemed to be breathing a bit more regularly. The small wound on its paw had stopped bleeding after careful cleaning with hydrogen peroxide. Outside, the lioness remained in the same spot, like a golden sentinel against the arid landscape. Every now and then, she would get up, take a few nervous steps, and return to her original position. Michael could feel her anxiety through the window glass. She was a desperate mother, trusting in the improbable to save her child. The following hours passed in constant vigilance. Michael checked the cub's temperature with the back of his hand, administered small amounts of liquid when it showed signs of thirst, and observed every movement, every sigh, every heartbeat he could feel in the small thoracic cage. Throughout this time, the silent presence of the lioness outside the house constantly reminded him of the responsibility he had assumed. Around noon, something extraordinary happened. The cub opened its eyes for the first time since arriving. They were crystalline blue, like small fragments of sky captured in its feline face. Michael felt hot tears spring to his eyes, an emotional reaction he hadn't expected. When was the last time he had cried? "Hello, little warrior," he whispered, extending a finger that was immediately investigated by the cub's wet nose. "You're going to be okay. Your mother didn't give up on you, and neither will I." The cub made a weak sound, something between a meow and a purr, and Michael felt as if his chest would explode with emotion. In that moment, looking into those blue eyes full of life, he understood that something fundamental had changed within him. The man who had fled from the world 5 years ago was discovering that there was still love stored somewhere deep in his soul. Through the window, he saw that the lioness had moved a few meters closer to the house. She too had sensed the change, perhaps through the maternal instinct that connects mothers to their offspring, even through walls and distances. For the first time since her arrival, Michael saw something in her golden eyes that could be interpreted as hope. The sun was beginning to decline when the sound of engines approached. Rose had arrived, accompanied by the specialist who could make the difference between life and the loss of that small being. Michael prepared himself to receive professional help, but a part of him no longer wanted to share that responsibility. In just a few hours, the cub had become something precious, a spark of light in his somber existence. While waiting for the visitors, Michael looked once more at the cub, which was now moving with more vigor among the warmed towels. "What should I call you?" he asked quietly. "You need a name, even if it's just for a while." He observed the delicate movements, the way the cub tried to balance on its still trembling paws, and a word naturally came to his lips. "Courage. Your name is Courage, because that's what your mother had to find me, and that's what you're showing by continuing to fight." The name echoed through the empty house, filling corners that had known only silence for years. Outside, as if she had understood that something important had just happened, the lioness raised her head toward the sky and remained that way for long minutes, a golden statue silhouetted against the infinite horizon of the American plains. Dr. Helen's arrival brought a professional perspective that Michael wasn't prepared to face. The wild feline specialist examined Courage with the precision of someone who had dedicated her life to understanding these magnificent animals, but her words sounded like small daggers in Michael's heart. "The cub is stable, but we need to be realistic about its chances," she said, adjusting her glasses while observing the still trembling movements of the small feline. "The dehydration has caused some damage, and that wound on the paw may have permanently compromised its mobility. Besides, separation from the mother at such an early age—" "But he's improving," Michael interrupted, with a firmness in his voice that surprised even himself. "He's drinking, moving, his eyes are bright." Rose and the specialist exchanged a look that Michael couldn't fully interpret, but which left him uneasy. There was something unsaid there, a concern that went beyond the cub's physical condition. "Michael," Rose said gently, "you need to understand that raising a wild feline isn't like caring for a domestic cat. Courage will grow, will develop instincts that can't be contained in a human environment. And there's the legal issue too." "Legal?" Michael felt a chill run down his spine. Wild animals can't be kept in captivity without specific authorization. Even in rescue cases, there are protocols to be followed. explained Dr. Helen. The ideal would be to transfer him to a specialized center as soon as he's stable. The words echoed through the house like gunshots. Michael looked at Courage, who at that moment was trying to stand on his trembling paws, and felt something fierce awaken within him. It was the same feeling that had made him flee the city 5 years earlier, when the world seemed determined to tear away from him everything he loved. "And the mother?" he asked, pointing to the window where the lioness continued her silent vigil. "She'll probably follow the cub wherever he goes," replied the specialist. "The maternal bond is very strong in this species. She won't abandon him as long as there's hope." After 2 hours of examinations and guidance, the two women prepared to leave. Rose hugged Michael with the familiarity of an old friend, whispering in his ear, "I know this is difficult for you, but think about what's best for the cub." When the sound of engines was lost in the distance, Michael found himself alone again with Courage and with thoughts he preferred not to delve into. The cub had managed to stand up and was walking unsteadily around the small improvised enclosure he had set up in the living room. Each movement was a small victory, each meow a symphony to his ears, thirsting for life. In the days that followed, a strange routine was established. Michael woke before dawn to check if Courage had passed the night well, prepared a special mixture of lactose-free milk with supplements that Rose had left, and watched fascinated as the cub gained strength with each passing hour. The wound on his paw was healing well, though it would leave a small mark that would always remind him of his dramatic origins. But it wasn't only Courage who was changing. Michael found himself talking to the cub during meals, narrating details of his isolated life that he had never shared with anyone. He told about the harsh winter of the previous year, when snow covered his house for 3 consecutive weeks. He talked about the books he read by candlelight during power outages, about the strange dreams that visited him on the quietest nights, and without realizing it, he began to talk about the past. "You know, Courage," he said one afternoon, as the cub played with a ball of yarn he had found in the back of a closet, "I once cared for someone small like you. It was a long time ago, in a life that seems to have belonged to someone else." The cub stopped playing and looked at him with those intense blue eyes, as if understanding that something important was being shared. "It was my son, Luke. He had hair as golden as the sun and laughed at everything, even the silliest things." Michael felt his voice falter and needed to pause. He loved animals, always asked for a dog, a cat, a bird, anything he could care for and love. Courage approached and touched his nose to Michael's hand, a gesture so gentle and understanding that it drew tears from the lonely man's eyes. "He would have loved you," he whispered. "He would have invented 1,000 games, 1,000 adventures. He would have made you laugh even when you were sad." That night, for the first time in 5 years, Michael opened the door to the room he kept locked at the end of the hallway. The air was heavy with the smell of stored memories, and a thin layer of dust covered everything like a protective veil. There were framed photos on the dresser, toys organized with the care of someone who could never part with them, small clothes still folded in the drawers. Courage followed him, curious about the new environment. He sniffed the corners, investigated the strange objects, and eventually settled on a colorful rug in the center of the room. It was as if he knew that this was a sacred place, a sanctuary of interrupted love. Michael sat on the small bed and picked up a framed photo from the bedside table. It showed a 5-year-old boy smiling while holding a kitten in his hands, his eyes shining with pure happiness. "His name was Luke," he said to Courage, who had approached and was observing the photo with feline interest. "He was brave like you, always ready for a new adventure, until the day when—" He couldn't finish. Some words were too heavy to be pronounced, even after so many years. Instead, he put the photo back in its place and reached out to caress Courage, who purred softly in response. That night, for the first time since arriving at the plains, Michael didn't sleep alone. Courage settled beside him on the bed, a warm and comforting presence that kept away the nightmares that used to visit him on the coldest dawns. Outside, through the open window, he could see the silhouette of the lioness outlined against the moonlight. She wasn't sleeping either, maintaining her maternal vigil even at a distance. The following days brought extraordinary discoveries. Courage was growing with surprising speed, and his unique personality was beginning to reveal itself. He was playful, but also observant, brave but cautious, affectionate but independent. Each new characteristic was a source of joy for Michael, who found himself rediscovering the simple pleasure of witnessing the development of another being. The cub learned to climb on furniture, to play with shadows projected on the wall, to follow Michael around the house like a small golden guardian. He developed specific food preferences, his own schedule for sleeping and playing, and peculiar habits that drew genuine smiles from his human protector. But not all discoveries were joyful. One morning, Michael woke to a strange noise coming from the kitchen. He found Courage trying to reach a piece of meat on the counter, and for the first time witnessed something that reminded him of the cub's true nature. The small claws, until then used only for harmless play, tore the wood of the furniture with impressive ease. The teeth, which he knew only as delicate tools for eating, proved sharp enough to pierce even resistant materials. Courage was not a domestic cat. He was a wild predator in formation, and his instincts were beginning to awaken. This realization brought a deep melancholy. Michael knew that this period of innocence and total dependence was temporary, but he wasn't prepared for the speed at which the changes were occurring. Each day, Courage became a little wilder, a little more independent, a little closer to his true nature. And there was another problem silently growing. The Lioness had begun to approach the house more during the nights. Michael saw her walking around the perimeter of the property, marking territory with an insistence she hadn't shown before. It was as if she understood that the time of separation was extending beyond what was natural, and her maternal anxiety was intensifying. One morning, upon opening the door to check the weather, Michael encountered something that made him instinctively retreat. The Lioness was just a few meters from the entrance, closer than she had ever been. She showed no aggression, but there was an intensity in her eyes that hadn't existed before. It was a warning, a silent communication that maternal patience had limits. Courage, who had grown enough to reach the window, saw his mother and emitted a sound that Michael had never heard before. It wasn't a meow, but it wasn't exactly a roar either. It was something primitive, ancestral, a call that echoed through millions of years of evolution. The Lioness responded with a similar sound, and for the first time since she arrived, Michael saw genuine tears in the mother's golden eyes. They were tears he recognized, because they were the same as his own. Tears of someone who loves and knows that loving sometimes means letting go. That afternoon, while Courage slept in a ray of sunlight coming through the living room window, Michael made a decision that he knew was inevitable, but which hurt like an open wound in his chest. He picked up the satellite phone and dialed the number Rose had left. "I need you to come," he said when she answered. "It's time we made a decision about Courage's future." Rose's arrival brought with it not only her familiar presence, but also the reality Michael had been trying to postpone. She didn't come alone this time. Accompanying her was a tall, serious man who introduced himself as Dr. Richard Mendez, a representative from the region's Conservation Institute. "Michael," Rose began with the delicacy of someone who knew well the sensitivity of the situation, "Dr. Richard has experience in reintegrating wild felines. He came to help us find the best solution for Courage." The man observed the environment with professional eyes, noting the adaptations Michael had made to accommodate the cub. There were scratches on the walls, repositioned furniture, and a subtle, wild odor that permeated the previously sterile house. "Where's the animal?" asked Dr. Richard with the scientific coldness that immediately irritated Michael. "He has a name," Michael responded with a hardness in his voice that surprised Rose. "His name is Courage." At that moment, as if he had been called, Courage appeared in the living room. In the 3 weeks since the specialist's arrival, he had grown considerably. His movements were more coordinated, his muscles more defined, and there was a natural grace in each step that revealed his noble lineage. The blue eyes, which before seemed lost, now demonstrated a sharp intelligence and an insatiable curiosity. Dr. Richard observed the cub with attention, making notes in a notebook. "He's well developed for his estimated age. Socialization with humans has created some atypical behaviors, but nothing irreversible if the reintegration is done properly." "Reintegration?" Michael felt his stomach tighten. "It's the natural process," explained the specialist. "The cub needs to return to its wild environment to develop the instincts necessary for survival. The mother is present, which significantly facilitates the process." As if she knew she was being discussed, the Lioness appeared at the kitchen window. She had become bolder in recent weeks, approaching the house whenever she sensed the presence of her cub. Her fixed gaze on Dr. Richard demonstrated an instinctive distrust toward the stranger. "Impressive," murmured the specialist. "We rarely see such persistent maternal dedication. She hasn't given up on him for a moment." Michael observed the interaction between mother and son through the glass. Courage had approached the window and was pressing his paws against the glass, trying to reach his mother. The sound he emitted was different from the meows Michael knew. It was a primitive call, a recognition of bonds that transcended time and separation. "How much time does he have?" asked Dr. Richard. "For what?" Michael responded defensively. "To adapt. Cubs of this species need to learn hunting and survival behaviors before 6 months of age. After that, adaptation becomes much more difficult, sometimes impossible." The words fell on Michael like heavy stones. 6 months. Courage was approximately 2 months old now, which meant only 4 months remained before separation would become inevitable. 4 months to prepare for yet another devastating loss in his life. That night, after the visitors left taking with them promises of return and detailed reintegration plans, Michael sat on the living room floor watching Courage play with a paper ball. The cub had developed a peculiar game. He would throw the ball with his paws, chase after it, and then bring it back to Michael, repeating the cycle indefinitely. It was a behavior that combined wild feline instincts with the desire for interaction learned through human coexistence. Living proof that Courage was becoming something unique, neither completely wild nor totally domesticated. "What are we going to do, little one?" Michael asked quietly. "How will I let you go when you've become the best part of my days?" Courage stopped playing and approached, settling beside Michael with the naturalness of one who had found his place in the world. His purr filled the silence of the house, a sound that had become the soundtrack of Michael's new life. The following days brought an emotional intensity that Michael hadn't experienced in years. Each moment with Courage became precious, each discovery a memory to be carefully guarded. He began to photograph the cub obsessively, documenting each phase of his growth as if he could capture time and prevent it from slipping through his fingers. Courage learned to open drawers, climb high shelves, imitate sounds he heard on the radio. He developed specific preferences for certain corners of the house, peculiar schedules for play, and a unique way of showing affection that involved small, affectionate bites on Michael's hands. But along with moments of tenderness, the first worrying signs of his wild nature blossoming also appeared. One morning, Michael woke to a crash coming from the kitchen. He found Courage on the table, having completely destroyed a chicken that was thawing for lunch. He hadn't just eaten the meat. He had torn the animal apart with an instinctive precision that revealed hunting behaviors naturally emerging. The blood on the small paws and muzzle of Courage created an image that deeply disturbed Michael. For a moment, he didn't see the affectionate cub he knew, but rather the wild predator he would inevitably become. "Courage, no," he reprimanded, and for the first time since the cub had arrived, his words were met with a low growl. It wasn't aggression directed at Michael, but rather an instinctive reaction to protect the conquered food. It was wild nature saying there were limits that couldn't be crossed, ancestral rules that not even human love could alter. From that day on, other incidents began to occur with increasing frequency. Courage destroyed pillows, left claw marks on furniture, and began to show territorial behaviors that included marking corners of the house with his scent. They weren't malicious actions, but natural expressions of a wild feline that was maturing. The situation became even more complex when, during a particularly violent storm, Courage reacted to the sound of thunder very differently from a domestic animal. Instead of seeking comfort with Michael, he hid under the bed and remained there for hours, refusing to come out even when the storm had passed. When he finally emerged from his hiding place, there was a subtle change in his eyes. It was as if the storm had awakened something primitive within him, an awareness that there existed a larger and more dangerous world beyond the safe walls of the house. Michael noticed that Courage began to spend more time looking out the window, observing the horizon with an intensity he hadn't shown before. Sometimes they would both remain silent for long periods, Michael reading a book, and Courage simply contemplating the vastness outside, as if hearing calls that only he could perceive. The Lioness had also changed her behavior. She approached the house more during the day, always maintaining visual contact with her cub through the windows. Michael noticed that she had lost weight in recent weeks, evidence that she was sacrificing her own feeding to remain close to her son. One afternoon, while observing this silent dance between mother and son, separated only by glass and wood, Michael understood a painful truth. He wasn't the only one suffering from that separation. The lioness was paying a high price for her decision to trust a human, and Courage was being deprived of essential teachings that only his biological mother could transmit. Guilt became a constant weight in Michael's chest. Each day that passed with Courage was one day less the cub had to learn to be wild. Each human lesson he absorbed was a natural lesson he failed to receive. The love Michael felt for him was transforming into a golden prison that could condemn him to a life of inadequacy in any environment. One night, unable to sleep, Michael got up and found Courage awake in the living room, staring fixedly at the front door. Outside, he could see the silhouette of the lioness, closer to the house than she had ever been. "So you feel her, don't you?" whispered Michael, kneeling beside the cub. "You know she's there, waiting for you." Courage emitted a low sound, almost inaudible, that sounded like a response. Then he did something that broke Michael's heart. He walked to the door and scratched the wood delicately, not with destructive force but with the gentleness of a request. It was the first time he had explicitly demonstrated the desire to go out, to meet the mother who patiently waited on the other side of the human barrier. Michael extended his hand and caressed Courage's golden back, feeling under his fingers the muscles that were developing, the strength that was growing, the independence that was flourishing. He knew that moment would come, but he hadn't imagined it would be so soon, nor that it would hurt so much. "Not yet, little one," he murmured, more to himself than to Courage. "Just a few more days. Let me have a few more days with you." But as he spoke, a part of him knew he was being selfish. Each additional day was a day stolen from Courage's wild future, one day less of preparation for the life he should really live. Outside, the lioness remained motionless until dawn, a golden sentinel waiting for the day when she could finally reclaim her son and teach him the ancestral secrets of their species. The moment Michael most feared arrived on an autumn morning, when the first leaves were beginning to yellow and the air carried the promise of inevitable changes. Courage had completed 4 months, and his transformation was impossible to ignore. He now had the size of an adult domestic cat, but with the muscular structure and natural grace of a wild predator. His blue eyes had gained a depth that spoke of awakening instincts, of an ancestral wisdom beginning to blossom. Dr. Richard returned accompanied by a small but prepared team. They brought monitoring equipment, a specially designed transport crate, and a professional determination that contrasted with the emotional turmoil Michael felt growing within him. "Today is the ideal day," announced the specialist after observing Courage interact with his mother through the window. "The lioness is healthy, despite the evident weight loss, and the cub shows clear signs of being ready for the transition." Michael felt as if the ground were disappearing beneath his feet. He knew this moment would come, had mentally prepared himself for weeks, but reality was much more painful than any preparation could mitigate. "Can I have a few minutes alone with him?" he asked, surprising himself with the firmness of his own voice. Dr. Richard hesitated, consulting his watch. "Of course, but we shouldn't prolong the process. Gradual separation is always more traumatic than a quick transition." When they were alone, Michael knelt on the floor of the living room, where so many precious memories had been created. Courage approached immediately, as he always did, but this time, there was something different in his behavior. It was as if he too felt that this moment was special, definitive. "You know, don't you?" Michael whispered, caressing the golden fur that had become thicker and shinier over the months. "You know it's time to return to where you really belong." Courage purred softly, but his gaze was directed toward the window, where his mother had positioned herself closer to the house than she had ever been. It was as if she too understood that the moment of reunion had finally arrived. Michael stood and went to the closet in what had been Luke's room. With trembling hands, he took a small, colorful blanket that his son had loved, and also a worn, stuffed toy, aged by time and love. They were objects that carried memories of another time, of another love, but which now found a new purpose. "I want you to take these things," he said, wrapping the objects in the blanket, "not because you'll need them, but because this way a part of both of us goes with you, wherever your journey takes you." Courage sniffed the objects with curiosity, and for a moment Michael imagined he could detect something familiar in the scent, the echo of memories of another child who had also loved unconditionally. The walk to the clearing chosen for the reunion was the longest and shortest of Michael's life. Each step brought him closer to the inevitable separation, but also to the possibility of seeing Courage finally find his true place in the world. Dr. Richard and his team maintained a respectful distance, allowing those final moments to be preserved in the intimacy they deserved. The lioness waited for them at the edge of the clearing, motionless like a golden statue. When she saw Courage descending from the transport crate, something extraordinary happened in her eyes. It was pure maternal joy, a relief so profound that it seemed to emanate from every fiber of her being. Courage hesitated for a moment, looking at Michael as if asking permission or perhaps silently saying goodbye. Then, with cautious but determined steps, he began to walk toward his mother. The meeting was more emotional than Michael could have imagined. The lioness approached slowly, carefully sniffed Courage, and then began to lick him with a delicacy that contrasted with her powerful nature. Courage allowed himself to be cared for, purring loudly enough for the sound to reach where Michael was watching. But then, something unexpected happened. Courage moved away from his mother and ran back to Michael, pressing his small body against the legs of the man who had been his family during those precious months. It wasn't fear, it was gratitude, recognition, a final gesture of love before the definitive farewell. Michael knelt and embraced Courage one last time, feeling hot tears stream down his face without caring who might be watching. "Be free, little warrior," he whispered. "Be wild, be strong, be everything you were born to be." With a gentle push, he encouraged Courage to return to his mother. This time the cub didn't hesitate. He walked determinedly toward the lioness, who received him with what could only be described as a feline smile. But before disappearing into the vegetation, the lioness did something that left all present speechless. She approached Michael, stopped a few meters away, and inclined her head in a clear gesture of recognition and gratitude. Her golden eyes met his for an eternal moment, communicating without words a mutual understanding. Mother to father, being who loves to being who loves. Then mother and son disappeared among the trees, taking with them a part of Michael's heart, but leaving something equally valuable in return. The certainty that true love always finds ways to express itself, even through the most improbable barriers. The journey back home was made in silence. Dr. Richard attempted some words of consolation, but Michael wasn't in the mood for conversations. His mind was full of memories, Courage attempting his first steps, sleeping curled up in warmed towels, playing with shadows on the wall, growing day by day until becoming the magnificent young feline who had just returned to his true home. The house seemed strangely empty when he arrived. The corners where Courage used to play echoed with his absence, and the silence that before was a companion now sounded like an accusation. Michael carefully stored the objects that had belonged to the cub, bowls, improvised toys, the blanket that had served as a bed, but couldn't bring himself to dispose of anything. The following days passed in a fog of longing and adaptation. Michael resumed his routine of isolation, but discovered it no longer satisfied him as before. The experience of caring for Courage had rekindled in him a capacity to love that he believed was lost forever. The house, once a perfect refuge, now seemed merely empty. It was on a winter morning, almost 3 months after the separation, that Michael made a discovery that would change his perspective on everything that had happened. Upon going out to check the solar panels covered with frost, he found something unusual on the porch, a small pile of objects carefully arranged. There were wild berries disposed in a circular pattern, branches woven in an artistic form, and in the center, a smooth, shiny stone that reflected the light of the rising sun. There were no human footprints in the area, nor signs that anyone had approached the house during the night. Michael examined the objects with growing emotion, recognizing in them an intentional organization, a pattern that spoke of intelligence and purpose. It was a gift, an offering, a form of communication that transcended the limitations of language. In the weeks that followed, other gifts appeared regularly. Sometimes they were arrangements of wildflowers, other times colored stones disposed in complex geometric formations. Each one seemed to carry a different message, but all shared the same essence: gratitude, remembrance, connection. Michael never saw who left the gifts, but his heart knew. Courage had grown, had learned the lessons that only his wild mother could teach, but hadn't forgotten the love he'd received during his first months of life. Somehow, he had found a way to keep alive the bond that united them, while respecting both his wild nature and the human need to know he had been important. One morning, Michael decided to reciprocate the kindness. He prepared a small offering of his own, some of Courage's favorite toys, carefully arranged next to the gifts he had received. It was his way of saying that the memories were reciprocal, that love had flowed in both directions. The next day, the toys had disappeared, but in their place he found the most beautiful of gifts, a small footprint impressed in the damp earth, surrounded by small white stones. It was perfect, delicate, but large enough to show how courage had grown. Michael knelt beside the footprint and pressed his own hand into the earth next to it. For a moment, he felt as if father and son were again connected, not through physical proximity, but through something much deeper and more enduring. In that moment, he understood a fundamental truth about love. It doesn't diminish with distance, doesn't disappear with separation, and doesn't need possession to be real. Sometimes the purest form of loving is allowing the loved being to fly free, trusting that true bonds transcend time and space. From that day on, Michael began to live with a peace he hadn't known in years. The solitude of his house on the plains was no longer a self-imposed exile, but a conscious choice of someone who had learned to find purpose in care, meaning in connection, and beauty in the infinite capacity of the human heart to love beyond itself. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, but now each change brought with it the possibility of a new gift, a new silent message that true love never really gets lost. It just finds new ways to express itself, even across the most vast distances and the deepest differences between species. And on clear nights, when the wind whispered secrets across the endless plains, Michael sometimes heard a distant sound that made his heart race. The young and strong roar of a feline who had found his place in the world, but who carried within himself, forever, the echo of human love that had saved his life and taught that courage is not the absence of fear, but the capacity to choose love even when parting hurts more than any physical wound. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Michael and courage has touched your hearts as deeply as it touched ours. This journey of unconditional love, sacrifice, and discovery reminds us that the truest bonds are those that transform us, teach us to grow, and show us that truly loving sometimes means having the courage to let go. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about unlikely connections and the transformative power of love. Find it here, by clicking to the left of your screens. If this story awakened something special in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day we bring unique narratives that explore the complexity of life, the nuances of the human heart, and the magic of encounters that change everything. Don't miss our upcoming content, and tell us in the comments how this story made you feel. Your words and experiences enrich our community and inspire us to continue sharing these emotional journeys. Until the next story, and remember, true love never disappears, it just finds new ways to manifest itself.